My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
Hello everyone, I'm Luke Hector and this is The Broken Meeple and you're watching a video about board games, card games and...
a cookie!
No, it's not a cookie!
So this is a Beyond the Base Game video where I talk about expansions to games because, let's face it, nobody else wants to. This is straight after the Moonraker video review I did. You notice I haven't even tidied up the table or anything because, frankly, everything's out that I need to show you. It's kind of handy to do it just straight after the other. So we got 3 expansions in total: Nomad, Binding Ties, and the newer Overload. These are not cheap expansions. I mean, you're going to set you back a good £22 to £27, maybe even slightly more for the Overload one. Basically, by the time you have bought all 3 of these, you're talking that you've spent somewhere in the region of about £65 to £75 to acquire these, on top of the money that you've spent on the base game. It's not a cheap game to acquire, and these are not particularly cost-effective expansions. However, do they elevate the game enough to make the price point worth it? Well, that's what I'm here to tell you. Most of the components are in the trays here, so I can show you them a bit more closely. But we're going to go in order of least good to best. Least good to best, I couldn't have said any better than that. You know what I mean, worst to best. That's a better idea. So we're going to start off with the worst one of the 3. Nomad. Nomad. Now that's not to say that worst means bad, but Nomad is definitely the expansion which I could happily leave out of the game and I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with it. Nomad is very specific in how it works, and most expansions, if they're really good, tend to not add too much complexity and seamlessly fold into the main game. Well, Nomad doesn't have that luxury because it changes a lot of the game quite fundamentally, mainly because of this map board here. Whoop, here we go. So you essentially have a map board where you place more ships and they represent different sectors, and essentially what happens now is that when you're selecting a contract, you have the opportunity to move to an adjacent location, and you can only attempt contracts that are of the color of the sector that you're in. So if you want to do an orange contract and you're over here in the corner on green, you won't actually be able to do an orange contract because you need to move across the map first. That's okay, I guess, but it just adds an extra restriction that you don't really need. On top of that, you have the one thing that I really don't like seeing in board games: event decks. Yes, there is an event deck. You draw an event at the start of the turn and you resolve it. It's the lazy man's way of trying to throw in some variety into a game, and I don't like them.
I hate this!
This one redeems itself slightly with one type of card, but you still have basically a bunch of events that will trigger off and do random things, and that's it. And I mean, they're not the most interesting events either for the most part. They're pretty generic. I mean, all damage requirements are increased by 1. All contracts with damage requirements have an extra credit reward. I mean, they do fairly half-decent stuff, but again, you could take this out of the game and you just wouldn't miss it. The main one that's interesting, though, is where you've got the policy events. Some of them are just straight up, they happen, but some of them have you do kind of like a sort of thumb up, thumb down vote sequence with the other players. This is quite cool. It adds a little bit of interaction, and it does, allow you to kind of change up some of the game rules in various ways. Like, for example, here, ship parts cost 1 credit more, crew cost a credit less, special training. So you might have some players that are going pretty heavily on ship parts. They don't want this to go through, but if you're a bit hard up for cash, you might be like, you know what, at least I can get some cheap crew cards. I'm up for that. These are cool. In fact, I would actually prefer if the entire event deck was nothing but these policy cards. I would actually be more on board for it, but because it's mixed with the 2 different types, I don't like the normal events. But as I say, it's not a massive deal, but it's just, again, event decks just feel like a way of padding out a game. There is a cool little anomaly detected square on here, which is a nice little thematic touch. Basically, there's one really hard contract that needs to be done by group players, and as soon as you complete it, you unlock like prototype ship parts that do really insane stuff. But you have to first detect the anomaly, find this 5th sector, and that has to be done as a group. So it's quite cool. That is a nice little thematic touch. I'm just surprised that that's the only one and there wasn't like more of them. So that's kind of what Nomad adds, and it's fine, but it does change up the game a little bit. I mean, having to move around this map sort of decreases your options for what contracts you can do, and it just feels like a little bit of a fiddly element. And the events are fine, but it's really the policy events that are more interesting, whereas the rest are not. On top of that, this game decides that it thinks, you know what, 2 hours isn't long enough to play a negotiation deck builder with some random elements. You need to play this for longer. I don't know what you're smoking when you come up with that kind of line of reasoning, but they throw in a board that allows you to play epic mode up to 15 prestige points. I will not do this. I have no intention of doing this. 15 prestige points is way too much. This is a game that takes up to 2 hours easily with 10 prestige points, particularly possibly longer than 2 hours with 5 players. The last thing I want this to do is start heading towards the 2.5 to 3 hour mark by just artificially making the game longer. I mean, you know, epic length games are fine when you're playing something with relatively like minimal luck, but here it's a deck builder with random die rolls. Do you want that kind of thing in a 2.5 to 3 hour game? I sure as hell don't. So, you know, not something I'm going to use either. So Nomad overall is okay, but you have to kind of replace various aspects of the game, and it does change the way it feels a lot more than the other two, which fit a lot more seamlessly. Let's still add more cool stuff. Nomad for me gets a 5 out of 10. It's an average expansion. It's fine. If somebody wanted to play with Nomad, I wouldn't be opposed to it. It's not like any of these elements are, you know, terrible or like really bad or like really ruin the game, but I don't miss it when it's gone, and I don't necessarily desire it to be there. So this is the one that gets brought out the least, and even then I would probably only want to bring this out with people who knew the game well. I certainly wouldn't want to throw in the map as a teaching tool. I think that's probably a bit much, but yeah, it does the job, but just not particularly good. It's definitely, I think, the third one you get. So now we'll get on to the second best expansion here, of my opinion, Moonraker Binding Ties. This one is the most seamless expansion out of the lot, because integrating this is so straightforward that pretty much I teach the game with this all the time, because it really doesn't add that much complexity, but adds a cool effect. And that is the faction board that you have, which basically just adds to the table space hog, because you've got to have this above your board now. But what you have is essentially a token of each other player in the game. So let's say I'm playing with yellow, blue, and green. I have their tokens here, and they will have a similar setup on theirs, but for the other players. The idea is that when you ally with another player and complete a contract, you gain a reputation with the player that you are allying with. So it encourages people to negotiate and make alliances, which in a negotiation game is a good thing. Not to say that the base game has people not making a lot of negotiations, but sometimes you'll jump into a contract and help someone out, mainly just because you want faction rep. And the faction rep can be spent in various ways, in like about 10 different ways. There's quite a lot of variety here. Essentially, you can spend up to 5 rep, that's the max you can level it up, and you either spend from the same color, or you can spend rep from different colors, and they do various effects. Obviously, the one that spends from a single color are more powerful, but if you get it all the way up to 5, you can spend it for a whole prestige point. 1 out of 10 points can literally just be done by allying a lot with the same player, and it does cause a cool dynamic within the game, with people being willing to help certain players, mainly just because they want to get their faction rep up. And I've done that before, particularly with players who are further behind on points. I'm like, look, you're a bit further behind on points. You can have more of the points on this contract. I'll take more of the money. I just want to continuously work with you while you're behind, because that's going to get my rep up to maximum, and then I can spend it later. Of course, everybody has their own agenda when they're playing a negotiation game. I mean, there's only one winner, but it does allow for a bit more depth and nuance with the negotiation aspect. But that's pretty much it. Yeah, the whole game is just that. I mean, was that really that difficult? You could easily just throw this into a game and nobody need know it was even an expansion. It's that seamless. On top of that, it also adds a few extra cards to the crew deck, the objectives, and the ship parts. So, you know, you had 20 crew before and 37 ship parts. Well, now you've got another 10 crew, another 10 parts, another 10 objectives, and another 10 contracts. Not a massive boost, but a decent number nonetheless. But mainly you're getting it for this reputation board. This expansion is really solid. It's very easy to include. You will pretty much never take it out of the game, even when you're teaching it, once you've got it down. And it's just pretty straightforward and adds something that makes probably one of the better aspects of the game just that little bit better. So, you know, it's a pretty, easy to include, seamless expansion. That is probably maybe just a little bit too expensive for what it includes. I mean, it does have to include a bunch of these boards and these little tokens and that, but yeah, these aren't cheap expansions for what you're getting. But still, Moonrakers Binding Ties gets a solid 8 out of 10. It's a good expansion, easy to throw in, and certainly worth grabbing. Maybe even as, you could argue maybe it should be your first expansion because it's the easiest one to include. But, you know, in terms of how much I like these expansions, I think the Binding Ties is easily second choice.
Second place? That's a fancy word for losing!
So now we get to the best expansion by far, Moonrakers Overload. Not the cheapest expansion for sure, but you're gonna want to get this. As soon as you know that you like the game, hopefully you like the game, but as soon as you know whether you like the game or not, this is the one you buy when you ask yourself the question, is there a way to get more content for this though? Yes, there is with this. Overload doubles the content from the base game. 20 crew cards is now 40 crew cards. 37 ship parts is now 74 ship parts. That's not including the extra 10 of each you get from Binding Ties. If you get these two expansions together, you will have a decent amount of ship parts. I mean, I forget if Nomads includes a few actually. I might just want to double check that for completeness purposes. Let's see. No, you just get event cards, a few objectives, some contracts, and the prototype ship parts. But yeah, you don't get any of the basic stuff, which is another blemish to the Moonraker Nomad set. But here, I now have this big deck of the ship parts. Loads of them now. I mean, 37 wasn't too bad, but it wasn't enough. But having double that size just means that you've got this huge deck of unique ship parts that give you endless amount of variety for trying to customize your ships. So cool. And on top of that, the crew cards have the same thing. I mean, these are sleeved, but, you know, not including the crew cards I got here. So here we go. Let's slap them together. That's a decent amount of crew cards now. So one of the two best aspects of the original game have now got the variety, and that problem is now fixed. Not to say I won't say no to more in the future. You want to release another Overload 2 expansion or something, I will definitely get it. But, oh man, it's so good to have it.
But wait! There's more!
Oh yeah, there's more. Advanced action cards. The deck building aspect of Moonrakers has been cranked up to 12 now because as well as all the basic thrusters and reactors and damage cards that have all gone and flown out of my hand, you know, that you had before, you now have advanced shields, advanced reactors, advanced thrusters, advanced damage. You know, you have all these, and it's not just one of each, there's two varieties of each. They're in separate little piles, and you can freely buy these with credits, or you get them as rewards off certain like ship parts or, you know, contracts that give you a bonus card. But there's multiple varieties here, and they essentially combine the ones that you've already seen, or they're doubly good from before. So for example, I can have a reactor that gives me 3 actions rather than 2, but alternatively I could have a reactor that gives me 2 actions and a card, so it does an element of the thrusters as well. You can have shield cards that block 2 hazard dice, or you can have a shield that also gives you a reactor power. You can have damage cards that give you more actions. You can have thruster cards that give you extra actions or draw 3 cards. There's a good amount of stuff here, and when you combine this with the base cards before, there is so much choice now for what you can do from the deck building aspect. You know, if Binding Ties is the expansion you buy to make the negotiation part of Moonrakers better, Overload is the one you buy to make the deck building part as good as it can be. And it really is as good as it can be with these new cards, because you now have lots of different ways to build your deck, and each one of these is cool to get. They're not cheap in terms of credit, but they're worth grabbing, and they certainly will give your deck a bit of a power boost. If anything, it kind of goes some way to try and speed up a little bit of the game, because being able to acquire some of these really cool cards will give you a good leg up with your deck a bit quicker than the base game certainly would. But it's, again, an easy one to include. I mean, would you teach it with it? I don't know, but the problem is, once you've shuffled in all the ship parts and the crew, yes, there's an icon for you to separate them out, but are you going to do that? Probably not. But this isn't a very complicated thing to teach. I mean, basically, it's like, look, here's a thruster card. Here's a thruster card that does the same, except it gives you an action as well. I mean, it's written on the card. It really isn't rocket science. So these are just pretty much an auto-include alongside with Binding Ties. I just really love the cool stuff that you can do with these. And again, it's more content. It's more stuff for you to do, more options, which, like I say, the expansion, very well named Overload, is doing that. It's overloading you with more choice. Now, there are a couple of extra things in this expansion. Yeah, I still haven't finished, although these extra things are kind of minor. You have these IOsphere tokens, which I don't know why they call them IOsphere. That is such a dumb name. It's not like the game is that thematic, for crying out loud. Basically, they're tokens, and some of the ship parts and the crew have you do various effects where you put the tokens on them and they might stick around for a while, or they do various effects when you spend them. That's literally what they are. I mean, IOsphere, nobody calls them that. I mean, if anything, you might as well just call them like Strepsil mints or something. I don't know, but it's really just such a minor inclusion. On top of that, it also includes a couple of like weird types of contract. You now have flex contracts, which are fine, but they basically work like pretty much any other contract, except they've got this little foil bit down the bottom, and essentially you can play any cards for those. So they can be shields, reactors, thrusters, whatever, but they usually require quite a lot of them. Okay, it's nice, you can throw them in, you wouldn't notice the difference, so great. But then they throw in these weird ones called flex head-to-head contracts, or is it just head-to-head? These, I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but it's so minor. I mean, this is all of them. That's it. There's about like 8 here, or 10 max. That's about it. And basically what happens is you try and do a contract, but then somebody else can go head-to-head to see whether they can complete it better. So it throws a competitive edge into an actual contract attempt. You can play with these if you like. Personally, I separate them out and never look back, but it's such a minor inclusion. I mean, that is it. I'm not losing any sleep by putting them in this tray and saying, nah, not gonna use them. So, very minor. Use them if you like. Personally, I just don't think they're that worth it. It's another rule to explain, and the game is already relatively smooth. I don't want to make it too fiddly now.
This is the way.
So Overload, despite the fact that it is a bit of a hefty price point, gets the full 10 out of 10 expansion. It is a must include. You know, yes, it's not cheap, and I totally get it if you're willing to, like, you know, hold back on your money, but it takes the deck building part up to a whole new level, adds so much more content, fixes the variety problem from the base game that I mentioned before. It's essentially the first expansion you should get without fail if you like Moonrakers. I mean, yes, Binding Ties is pretty good as well, but it's a fairly minimalistic expansion. But, you know, once you've got Overload and Binding Ties together, that is the true version of Moonrakers. You know, you put these two together and then rate Moonrakers, you can bring this game up to at least an 8, if not a 9 out of 10. I would certainly be willing to give it possibly a seal of distinction if you include those two expansions. Now, Nomad, as I say, it's the first one I think that came out, a little bit of a letdown, changes the game up a little bit too much, doesn't add any extra real content, it just changes rules, and the best expansions normally just add more of the good stuff but crank it up to 11 rather than try to augment the game that's already set in place. So you can do without Nomad and probably bypass this one, but the other two you're definitely going to want. Now, one last thing to mention though that is quite important: the storage. Each one of these expansions comes with a game tray, and the game trays hold cards pretty well, but this is only because I have sleeved the big cards and not the little cards. When I've done that, it's pretty good. However, I still have to have cards in baggies in order to store this in the game. Not that many, just 3 big bags for the basic cards. It's very easy to separate them out, it's not a problem. But that's because you're going to struggle to get everything into this box once you get all the expansions, because there's no spaces to put things like your IOsphere tokens or, you know, some of the extra bits or the extra boards, for example. Although I do like the design for the Binding Ties one, where it's actually got a like slit at the top of it where you can basically put all the boards for the for the reputations. That's pretty cool, and they do all fit in there quite nicely. But I believe you can fit the cards into this insert, but that involves you not sleeving a single thing, and for a deck builder I don't recommend that, honestly. You're going to want to sleeve the big cards, I would say, alone, but it's still going to be pretty much a squeeze, and you're still going to have to try and find some way to put the other boards in there along with all the rule books and such. So really, the insert kind of loses its edge once you've got all 3 expansions, and for that reason, I don't use it anymore. It's a very easy storage, though, if you just take out the insert and use the trays that come with the expansions, because you'll have 3 of these trays, well, 1 per expansion, basically, and you'll be able to put a lot of the content in these trays, and all the boards and rulebooks will fit in the big box easily, and whatever you can't fit in the trays, you simply just use a bag. And like I say, this just holds like the basic shields and that. All I gotta do is take out the entire deck of cards, shields, thrusters. That's it, and I've got 3 bags in the box. It really doesn't slow the setup time, and I don't think I really need a particular insert to be made for this. I think that setup works pretty well. But if people have got some ideas on how they fit everything into the box and still make it pretty orderly, then by all means put your suggestions in the comments. But yeah, I am that one to not sleeve a deck builder, but if you don't sleeve anything at all, you might be able to squeeze it in. But seriously, I think there's better ways to do it. Anyway, I digress. That is the 3 expansions for Moonrakers. 5 out of 10 for Nomads, 8 out of 10 for Binding Ties, and a 10 out of 10 for Overload. Easily my favourite of the 3. That's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube and thumb it up on Board Game Geek when it goes live on the page. Don't forget to check out the Moonrakers review itself. I mean, why would you watch this in advance of watching the Moonrakers review unless you own the game? That kind of doesn't make sense. But by all means, check out both videos, thumb them up. Also check out Fractured Sky from the same publisher. This is the 3rd of 3 videos I have done for them. Thank you again for the review copies. And of course, check out all the other content on the channel as well. So until next time, regardless if you're willing to earn reputation with the Broken Meeple or not, it's still only a game, so take care and bye for now.